On Thursday, July 11th, former President Donald Trump will become the first American chief executive in history to be sentenced on criminal charges in New York City. I'm Tim Darnell, and welcome to this special edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First from our Midtown Atlanta First Alert Desk. We are joined on this historic occasion by Kennesaw State Professor of Political Science, Dr. Ben Taylor. Dr. Taylor, we're in uncharted territory. We're going to be witnessing history in just a few hours. How do you think this sentencing process is going to play out in New York City?
Well, a lot of it depends on what the actual sentence is, right? So judges, particularly in New York State, as I understand it, have quite a bit of leeway when it comes to sentencing, particularly on this level of felony. Donald Trump would be a first-time offender, so there are a number of things in New York law and laws across the country, actually, that would give him some breaks in terms of sentencing. So, but regardless, the big political fallout thing here is that for hours and hours and hours and days, as we've been talking about this since he was actually convicted a few weeks ago, this is something that now the Biden campaign has been making mention of. Headlines across the world. I mean, this Donald Trump is a convicted felon, and that you will see a convicted felon be sentenced in a court of law who is also just so happens to be, or in the coming days will also be the nominee for one of the two major parties in American politics for president of the United States. That is a pretty shocking moment, and so far, what little evidence we have in terms of polls, in terms of how this is affecting people's attitudes towards the candidates, we have seen a bit of movement towards President Biden. Will that movement grow, or will it solidify as a result of this process? We'll have to wait and see, but those are the kinds of things that you would think would happen after this event.
There's a lot of speculation as to whether or not Judge Juan Marchand will sentence Donald Trump to any jail time. Are there any pros or cons politically? And I know I'm phrasing this very awkwardly, but are there any pros or cons to Donald Trump's presidential campaign, to him being sentenced to an actual jail term, or simply put on probation and free on bond?
Well, so that's a great question, and the bottom line is that we do have evidence of previous presidential candidates campaigning for president from jail, right? So in the 1920s, we had the socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs, who was in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary actually running for president. But obviously he's a third-party candidate, was never going to win. So that's a poor example, but at least there is that example. The other thing to note is that the Trump campaign has already been fundraising off of this. They raised lots and lots of money in the days immediately following the actual guilty verdict. They have merchandise on the Trump campaign website that you can buy that talks about Donald Trump being a felon. So on some level, from a campaign electoral politics point of view, the candidate and the campaign seem to be embracing this in some way. But I'm not really sure how a candidate embraces going to prison. I just don't know how that works. And so it seems unlikely that would be beneficial, but at the same time, we are in totally unprecedented campaign territory here. So, and in this era of polarization, the bottom line is that it almost doesn't matter what the sentence is. Trump advocates and his most fervent supporters are going to continue to support him. It's those people in the middle. It's those precious few moderate independent voters, many of whom live in the Atlanta suburbs, for instance, who are going to make the difference in the election generally. And so it's really their response to what this sentence looks like and how do they feel about it, and what does it do to their vote choice that's going to make the big difference in November.
Depending on the sentence, whether or not it's a fine, probation, actual jail time, how does this sentencing affect the case proceeding against him in Georgia? We know that the Georgia Court of Appeals has issued a stay on all criminal proceedings brought against the former president and more than a dozen of his Republican allies in regards to their alleged attempts to overturn Georgia's 2020 election. Does the sentence actually have a political impact on what's happening here in Georgia?
Well, I think so. I don't know about the effect it would have on the appellate process itself. I think that's its own thing entirely, and I'm not entirely sure that those judges would be affected by that. But I think that, again, every time there's been some sort of legal finding against Donald Trump in the last few years, since he's been out of office, he's had nothing, and it seems nothing but legal trouble. And every time something else happens, whether it's being indicted or having civil judgments against him or civil judgments against his organization, the Trump organization, it seems that every time that happens, his supporters have redoubled their support. They seem more engaged, more reverential towards Donald Trump. And there's no reason to think that would change, regardless of the sentence. But in terms of what may happen to the other legal proceedings, my sense is that, and again, I'm not a legal expert per se, but my sense is that this will slow some of that down. And so it seems unlikely at present, again, things could change, but it seems unlikely that we're going to have much more action against former President Trump before November, particularly in terms of having trials that conclude. So.
One thing you mentioned in your first comment, we obviously July 11th, Thursday, beginning at 10 a.m., Donald Trump will be sentenced. Less than a week later, only a few days later, the Republican National Convention convenes and organizes in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What does Donald Trump have to do at the Republican National Convention? He's already secured the presidential nomination. Nominating conventions, political conventions such as these, are so tightly scripted nowadays, there are really no surprises. What can we expect in Milwaukee beginning Monday, July 15th?
Well, again, depending on the sentence, I would expect, well, first of all, we know kind of how the Trump campaign is going to run this thing. They've already done it twice, 2016 and 2020. So even though 2020 is a weird example, but we have a sense of how this is going to go. And now that the Republican Party is very much the party of Donald Trump, so unlike 2016 where he was actually battling with people like Ted Cruz about delegates and would he be the nominee, that's not happening. This is going to be a full-on coronation. And so the big agenda item, I would imagine, the big agenda item for any presidential campaign at a convention is to rally the troops, throw red meat to the base, and get the people excited to go out for the fall campaign, culminating on Election Day in November. And that's going to be the task for the Trump campaign as well. The difference is that they will now know the sort of criminal penalty fate of their candidate, which is going to put a different light on things potentially. And again, the issue is the people who are going to be in that convention hall, their minds aren't changing no matter what happens. Those people are dyed in the wool. They're not changing. The question is, what is happening to those middle-of-the-road, independent voters, people who don't pay attention to politics a lot? They probably don't like politics. They're not really engaged. They might watch the evening news, but they're not really news junkies per se. But they might even know about all the things that have been going on with Donald Trump. Now that this is going to be ever present between now and then in terms of his legal troubles and all the various things that have been going on with him, how does that affect their attitudes and behavior? That's the big question. And there's not much that the Republican convention can probably do to help them on that front, but we'll have to wait and see.
But what are the optics of one of the two major national political parties actually nominating a convicted felon for the highest office in the land?
Well, there's not much they can do now, right? There's not really a process to remove the nominee shy of some sort of existential issue, right? His untimely death or something to that effect. So this is it. They've made their bed, as it were. So I think that the optics are something that the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign particularly also are trying to work on. They're trying to frame this information in a way that is most beneficial to them. And the Trump campaign is trying to make the argument that this is somehow nefarious, some sort of so-called witch hunt. President Trump is fond of using that language. And the issue is we don't know yet if moderate or independent voters are buying that, and we probably won't know until November or sometime around then.
Well, on Thursday, July 11th at 10 a.m., we will be covering the sentencing. Former President Donald Trump, already convicted on 34 felony counts of business falsification, records in relation to a hush money scheme relating to his 2016 presidential campaign. We will have live coverage of his sentencing, and also we will be covering extensively the Republican National Convention beginning on Monday, July 15th. Thanks to Dr. Ben Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University, for joining us, and thanks to all of you for watching and listening to this edition of Political Update on Atlanta News First. Watch Political Update on Atlanta News First on all of our streaming applications every Wednesday afternoon.